Let me take you back 5 years to the day the entire kingdom of Veyrith gathered to watch their alpha king get married. Adrian was not just any king. He was the alpha, the strongest wolf in a kingdom built on strength, a man who had clawed his way to the throne after his father's death, who had unified 3 warring packs through sheer will and cold, calculated leadership. Men feared him. Women admired him from a careful distance. And somehow, impossibly, he was about to marry a girl who had grown up 2 kingdoms away in a smaller, gentler court that dealt in poetry and trade agreements instead of blood and territory. That girl was Elena. She wasn't royalty by birth in the way Adrian was. Her family ruled a modest principality, more diplomats than warriors, and the marriage between her and Adrian had been arranged to secure peace between their lands. A political match. That's how it started, at least. But Elena, sweet, clever, endlessly hopeful Elena, had fallen in love with the idea of him long before she ever arrived in Veyrith. She had heard stories of the king who protected his people fiercely, who never lost a battle, who carried the weight of an entire kingdom on shoulders that never seemed to bend. She thought, foolishly perhaps, that a man capable of that kind of strength must also be capable of that kind of love. She was wrong. Or at least, she believed she was wrong. And that belief would cost them both 5 years of their lives. Picture it. The chapel doors, carved from white oak, wrapped in silver vines for the occasion. Hundreds of guests. Adrian standing at the altar in his ceremonial black, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed forward. Because that was simply how Adrian stood, how he always stood, like a man bracing for a blow that never came. He did not smile easily. He never had. But those close to him, his advisors, his guards, would later say that on that morning, for just a moment, there had been something different in his eyes. Something almost like hope. Elena was in the bridal chamber, in a gown so heavy with pearls it took 3 maids to lift the train. And she was crying. Not the happy tears everyone assumed. She was staring at herself in the mirror, gripping a folded piece of parchment so tightly her knuckles had gone white. That parchment was a letter. Her letter. The last one she had written to Adrian, 3 days before the wedding, pouring out everything she had never been brave enough to say to his face. How she loved him. How she was terrified he didn't love her back. How she needed just one sign, one small gesture, to know that this marriage meant something to him beyond duty. She had given that letter to a friend to deliver. A friend she trusted completely. His name was Marcus. And Marcus never delivered it. Chapter 2. I need you to understand something about Marcus because he is the hinge this entire story swings on. Marcus had grown up alongside Elena. He was handsome, charming, endlessly attentive in the way Adrian never seemed to be. While Adrian was off drilling soldiers or settling border disputes, Marcus was the one who noticed when Elena's favorite flowers bloomed, who remembered the small things, who made her laugh when she was anxious about the wedding. Somewhere in the months leading up to that wedding, Marcus had convinced himself that he loved Elena. And worse, he had convinced himself that he deserved her more than a cold, distant king ever could. So when Elena, trembling with nerves, handed him that letter and begged him to give it to Adrian before the wedding, to give her fiancé one last chance to show he cared, Marcus took the letter, walked straight to Adrian's private study, and lied. He didn't hand over the letter at all. Instead, he told Adrian that Elena had asked him to relay a message because she couldn't bear to say it to his face. He told Adrian that Elena had written those words out of guilt, not love. He twisted her trembling, desperate confession of, "I need you to show me you love me," into something cruel and cold. That Elena thought Adrian was incapable of love, that she pitied him, that she was only marrying him because she had no other choice, and that she resented every moment of it. Adrian, who had spent his entire life being underestimated, dismissed, and doubted by people who thought a warrior couldn't also be gentle. Adrian believed him completely. Something in him closed that day. Right there in his study, 3 days before his wedding, the small flicker of hope he'd allowed himself simply went out. He never confronted Elena. He never asked her directly, because Adrian was a proud man, and prouder men do not go begging to be loved by someone who has already made clear they don't want them. Instead, he did what wounded people so often do. He armored himself. He grew colder, distant. On their wedding day, when Elena searched his eyes for any sign of warmth, all she found was that same unreadable stone expression, and she assumed, just as Adrian had assumed about her, that the coldness meant "I don't love you." Neither of them knew they were reading from a script written entirely by Marcus's lie. Chapter 3. The wedding march began. Elena walked down that long aisle with her father's arm looped through hers, her heart hammering, silently praying that when she reached the altar, Adrian would look at her the way she needed him to look at her. Just once. She reached him. He looked at her. And what she saw in his eyes wasn't love. It wasn't warmth. It was distance. Carefully, deliberately built distance, though she couldn't have known that's exactly what it was. The priest began the ceremony. Elena stood there, her whole body trembling, replaying every letter she had ever sent Adrian that had gone unanswered, every attempt she had made to draw close to him that had been met with polite, formal indifference. She thought of the letter Marcus had delivered, the one she believed Adrian had read and simply chosen not to respond to. She thought, he knows exactly how I feel, and he still looks at me like this. He will never love me. I will spend my entire life married to a man who sees me as nothing more than a treaty. And in that moment, standing in front of hundreds of witnesses, Elena panicked in a way she would spend the next 5 years regretting. She turned. She ran. Not metaphorically. She picked up the front of that heavy pearled gown, and she ran down the aisle, past her stunned family, out the chapel doors, into a waiting carriage that, unbeknownst to almost everyone there, had been arranged in advance by Marcus. Because Marcus had been counting on exactly this. He had spent weeks quietly convincing Elena that Adrian would never truly love her, weeks positioning himself as the only person in her life who did. Adrian stood at that altar in front of his entire kingdom and watched the woman he had let himself hope for, however briefly, however guardedly, vanish through the chapel doors without a single word. He didn't chase her. He simply turned to the priest and, in a voice so flat it frightened the guards standing nearest him, said, "The ceremony is over." Then he walked out the side entrance, alone, and nobody in Veyrith saw their king smile again for a very long time. Chapter 4. Now, here's where I have to slow down, because these next 5 years shaped everything that came after, for both of them. Elena left with Marcus that day, along with her younger brother Finn, who was barely 5 years old at the time. Their parents had passed years earlier, and Elena had been raising him essentially alone since. She couldn't leave him behind. Wherever she went, Finn went too. At first, life with Marcus felt like relief. He was warm where Adrian had been cold. He said the things she had always wanted to hear. For a while, Elena told herself she had made the right choice, that she had escaped a loveless, suffocating marriage for a man who actually saw her. But warmth, I've learned, is not the same as substance. Marcus had charm, but he had no real plan, no real fortune of his own beyond what he'd hoped to gain by attaching himself to Elena's royal name. Without her title, without her family's backing, which evaporated the instant she fled her own wedding in disgrace. Marcus's prospects crumbled fast. He took to gambling, then to debt, then to worse. Elena spent years watching the man she'd given up a kingdom for slowly become someone she barely recognized. Someone who disappeared for days, who came home reeking of drink and desperation, who grew resentful of the very brother she had brought with her, seeing Finn as a burden rather than family. Still, Elena stayed. Partly out of pride, she could never admit, especially to herself, that she might have made a catastrophic mistake. Partly because she genuinely believed until the very end that the man underneath the debt and the drink was still the man who had once made her laugh. Then, a little over 5 months ago, Marcus died. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't kind. He died owing money to men who did not forgive debts, in a fight that started over coin and ended with Elena burying him in an unmarked grave because she couldn't afford a headstone. And when the men he owed came looking for what was theirs, Elena discovered the truth of just how deep that debt ran. Everything, the modest home they'd shared, what little jewelry she had left, even furniture, was seized or sold. She and Finn were left with nothing, not a coin, not a roof they could call their own. For months, Elena did whatever she could. She took in mending. She scrubbed floors in a tavern that paid barely enough for bread. She and Finn slept in the back room of a stranger's stable more nights than she likes to remember. She was, by any measure, destitute. A fallen princess nobody recognized, scraping by in a kingdom that wasn't even her own. And then Finn got sick. Chapter 5. It started as a cough, then a fever that wouldn't break. Within 4 days, Finn, now a small, thin 10-year-old with the same soft brown eyes their mother had, was barely conscious, burning hot to the touch, murmuring things that made no sense. The village healer took one look at him and told Elena, gently but plainly, that this was wolfsbane fever, a sickness common among shifter bloodlines, and fatal within a week if untreated. The only cure was a healing elixir brewed from moonflower root, a plant that grew almost nowhere except the royal gardens of exactly one kingdom. Veyrith. Elena sat on the floor of that stable with her brother's head in her lap, his small body trembling with fever, and she realized with a kind of sick, inevitable clarity that there was only one place in the world she could get what he needed in time. She would have to go back. Back to the kingdom she had fled in front of hundreds of witnesses, back to the man she had left standing at the altar, humiliated in front of his entire court. Back to Adrian. I want you to imagine the terror of that decision. Not just the shame of facing a man you betrayed in the cruelest, most public way imaginable, but the terror of not knowing what he would do to you when you arrived. Adrian was the Alpha King. He had every right, by law and by pack tradition, to have her imprisoned, exiled, or worse, the moment she set foot back in Veyrith. But Finn's lips had started turning faintly blue by the second night, and Elena decided, with the fierce, unshakable love only an older sister who has raised a child alone can understand, that her pride, her shame, even her own safety meant absolutely nothing next to her brother's life. She wrapped Finn in the one good blanket they had left, borrowed a farmer's cart with a promise she'd repay him she had no way of keeping, and set off for the palace of Veyrith. Chapter 6. She arrived at the palace gates at dawn, 5 years almost to the day since she had run from them. The guards didn't recognize her at first. 5 years, hunger, grief, and exhaustion had changed her. Her once soft, well-kept hands were rough and cracked, her cheeks hollow, her once elegant gowns replaced by a plain traveling cloak stained from the road. It was only when she gave her name, choking on the syllables, that recognition dawned in their eyes, followed swiftly by something colder. Whispers. Stares. Elena, one of the older guards said slowly, like he was testing whether the word could possibly be true. The runaway bride. She didn't argue with the title. She simply said, "Please, my brother is dying. I need to see the king." They could have turned her away right there. By all rights, they probably should have. But something, maybe the raw desperation in her voice, maybe Finn's visibly failing state in her arms, made the guard captain send word to the throne room instead. Word reached Adrian mid-council session. I can only imagine what that moment must have looked like. His advisors mid-argument about grain tariffs, and then a single sentence whispered into the king's ear that stopped the entire room cold. "She's returned, Your Majesty. Elena is at the gates." They say Adrian didn't react outwardly at all. 5 years of iron discipline had taught him never to let a room see what he was feeling. He simply stood, said the council was adjourned, and walked out. But those who knew him best, his personal guard, Captain Rowan, who had served him since they were boys, later admitted that Adrian's hands were shaking as he walked down that corridor. 5 years of carefully built walls, and one sentence had cracked every single one of them. Chapter 7. Elena had rehearsed what she would say 100 times on the journey there. Every version started with an apology and ended in desperate begging. None of the versions prepared her for actually standing in the palace's grand entrance hall, watching Adrian descend the staircase toward her. He was different. Harder, somehow, though every bit as devastating to look at as she remembered. Broader through the shoulders, a small scar now cutting through one eyebrow. His dark hair longer, his eyes even more guarded than before. He stopped several feet away from her, close enough to see her clearly, far enough to make the distance between them unmistakable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. 5 years of history stretched silently between them. Then Finn coughed, a weak, rattling sound, and whatever pride, whatever rehearsed dignity Elena had been clinging to, shattered instantly. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm not here for myself. I know what I did. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. But my brother, Finn, you remember him? He was just a little boy when... He's dying, Adrian. It's wolfsbane fever. The healer said moonflower elixir is the only thing that can save him, and it only grows here. I'll do anything. I'll give you anything I have left, which isn't much, I promise you that. Just please, please save him. He's innocent in all of this." Adrian's eyes moved from Elena's tear-streaked face down to the small, fevered boy in her arms. Something shifted behind his expression. Something Elena couldn't quite read. Though if you'd asked Captain Rowan, standing a few steps behind his king, he would have told you it was the closest thing to real pain he'd seen on Adrian's face in 5 years. Adrian was quiet for what felt to Elena like an eternity. Then he said, low and even, "Bring the boy to the healers, now." Servants rushed forward instantly. Elena, shaking, handed Finn over, watching him disappear down the hallway with a knot of physicians already calling for moonflower root and warm broth. She turned back to Adrian, breathless. Thank you. Don't," Adrian said, and the single word landed like a wall going up between them. "I'm not doing this for you." Elena flinched. "I understand. The elixir, the healers, the physician's time. None of it is free," he continued, his voice carefully controlled. "You will repay the debt, every coin of it." "I have nothing," Elena admitted quietly. "I have nothing left, Adrian, I swear to you." "Then you'll work it off," he said. "You'll serve in this palace as a maid until the debt is settled. You will follow every rule given to you. You will not use your former title. As far as this staff is concerned, you are simply a servant girl, nothing more." It should have felt humiliating. In some ways, it was. The girl who had once been meant to rule this very palace as its queen would now scrub its floors as one of dozens of nameless maids. But Elena didn't hesitate for even a second. "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, of course, thank you." Adrian studied her for one more long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes, before he turned and walked away without another word. Elena stood alone in that grand hall, 5 years of guilt and grief and desperate gratitude crashing over her all at once, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Chapter 8. Finn's recovery took nearly 2 weeks. The moonflower elixir worked slowly but steadily, and Elena was allowed to visit him each evening after her duties were done, sitting by his bedside in the servants' infirmary, watching the color slowly return to his cheeks. During the day, Elena became simply Ellie, a name she gave the head housekeeper, Mrs. Byrne, a stern but not unkind older woman who ran the palace staff with brisk efficiency. Elena scrubbed floors she used to walk across in silk slippers. She hauled water, mended linens, polished silver that still, faintly, bore the royal crest she once expected to wear. It was humbling in the truest sense of the word. And strangely, it was also the first time in years Elena had felt something close to purpose. There was no Marcus to manage, no debts hanging over her that she couldn't see the bottom of, no performance of happiness to keep up. Just work. Simple, tiring, honest work. The other maids were curious about her at first. The new girl who spoke a little too properly, who carried herself with a poise none of them could quite place. But Elena kept her head down, deflected questions, and slowly earned a quiet respect for her work ethic, if not her openness. She saw Adrian only rarely in those early weeks, usually from a distance, crossing a courtyard, addressing his council from a balcony, once even passing her directly in a hallway while she carried an armful of linens. He didn't recognize her, or if he did, he gave absolutely no sign of it. Elena told herself that was for the best. She had a debt to repay and a brother to nurse back to health. Nothing more. She almost believed it too, until the night of the council meeting that changed everything. Chapter 9. About 6 weeks into her servitude, Elena was assigned to help serve refreshments during an emergency council session, a task usually reserved for more senior staff, but 2 maids had fallen ill and Mrs. Byrne was short-handed. The dispute, Elena gathered quickly as she poured water and set out trays, concerned a stretch of contested farmland along Veyrith's southern border. Land claimed by 2 rival noble families, the Hartleys and the Cross family, both of whom had legitimate-sounding historical claims dating back generations. Tensions had escalated to the point that armed skirmishes had already broken out between their tenant farmers. If the council didn't resolve it soon, it threatened to spiral into open conflict between 2 powerful houses, a conflict that could destabilize the entire southern half of the kingdom. Elena, standing quietly near the wall with a serving tray, listened as advisor after advisor proposed solutions that all seemed to miss something obvious. The land should simply be split evenly down the river, one advisor argued. That ignores the fact that the Hartleys' original deed predates the river even being the boundary, another shot back. Splitting it evenly rewards a claim with less historical merit. Back and forth it went, voices rising until Adrian, visibly frustrated at the head of the table, called for a short recess to let tempers cool. As servants moved to refill cups, Elena, without entirely meaning to, murmured under her breath, mostly to herself. They're arguing about the wrong thing entirely. She hadn't meant to be heard, but Adrian, seated closer than she'd realized, caught it. "What did you say?" he asked, his sharp eyes turning toward her. Elena froze, tray in hand, every eye in the room suddenly on her. For a moment, panic screamed at her to apologize and disappear back against the wall where servants were supposed to remain invisible. But then she thought of the skirmishes already breaking out, of farmers on both sides who had nothing to do with noble pride yet stood to lose everything, and something in her simply couldn't stay quiet. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "It's only that both families are arguing over ownership of the land itself, when the actual value in dispute is the river access and the grazing rights that come with it. The land alone, without water access, is nearly worthless to either side. If you granted the Hartleys formal title to the land itself, which satisfies their historical claim, but established a permanent binding agreement giving the Cross family shared river access and grazing rights in perpetuity, both families would gain the thing they actually need, without either having to publicly lose the argument over ancestral ownership." The room went silent. One of the older advisors, Lord Pemington, actually set down his cup. That's actually rather clever." Adrian was staring at Elena with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floor. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Slower." She did, laying it out more precisely this time, how pride and practicality could be separated, how both families could walk away claiming victory while the thing that actually mattered, the resource itself, was shared fairly. Within the hour, the council had drafted the framework of exactly the agreement Elena described. The skirmishes stopped within the week. War, quite possibly, had been averted by a maid nobody in that room had known the name of an hour before. But Adrian knew her face now. And more than that, he couldn't stop wondering who exactly this Ellie really was. Chapter 10. Adrian did not simply let the matter drop. That night he asked Mrs. Byrne for the maid's full record, where she'd come from, how she'd been hired. "She came through the side gate about 6 weeks back, Your Majesty," Mrs. Byrne explained, slightly puzzled by the king's personal interest in a servant. "Sick brother, if I recall. Said her name was Ellie. Quiet girl, keeps to herself, but works harder than most." It wasn't much to go on, and it certainly didn't explain how a servant girl understood land law and negotiation strategy well enough to outthink an entire council of trained advisors. Adrian found himself, against every instinct of a man who prized control and predictability, unable to stop thinking about her. He began noticing her more after that, not obviously, never in a way the staff would remark on, but he found his eyes drawn to her whenever she was in a room. The careful, precise way she folded linens, the gentleness in her voice when she spoke to the younger servants, the way she sometimes hummed softly to herself when she thought no one was listening, a melody Adrian realized, with a jolt he didn't examine too closely, that he recognized, a lullaby, one that had once been hummed to him by his own mother, long before she died. He told himself it meant nothing. Lullabies were common. Anyone could know one. But the recognition unsettled him regardless, in ways he couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, Finn had recovered fully and, with a child's boundless energy, had become something of an unofficial mascot among the kitchen staff, charming cooks into extra sweets and following the palace dogs around the courtyard. Elena watched her brother laugh and run freely for the first time in longer than she could remember, and felt, for the first time in 5 years, something like real peace. It was, of course, too fragile to last. Chapter 11. It happened almost by accident. Elena had been asked to deliver a stack of correspondence to Adrian's private study late one evening. The usual runner had fallen ill, and Mrs. Byrne, trusting Elena's discretion, sent her instead. She knocked, received no answer, and, assuming the room empty, let herself in to leave the documents on his desk as instructed. But Adrian was there, seated near the fireplace, a single opened letter held in his hands, his expression tight with something that looked almost like frustration or shame. He looked up sharply when she entered. "I said, leave it outside," he said, an edge in his voice she hadn't heard directed at her before. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I didn't hear—" Elena stopped mid-sentence, her eyes catching, almost involuntarily, on the letter in his hands. It was held upside down. She realized it a half-second too late to hide her reaction. Adrian saw the recognition flicker across her face, and something in him went rigid. "Get out," he said quietly. "Adrian." The name slipped out before she could stop it. Too familiar, too intimate for a servant to use with her king. His eyes snapped to hers, startled. Elena caught herself immediately, dropping into a hasty curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect. I only—" She hesitated, weighing the risk, and then, because some part of her simply couldn't bear to see him look so cornered, so exposed, she said gently, "I won't tell anyone." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Tell anyone what?" "That the letter is upside down," Elena said softly. "That you weren't reading it. That you can't." The silence that followed was long enough that Elena genuinely feared she'd overstepped in a way that couldn't be undone, that she'd humiliated the most powerful man in the kingdom and would pay for it dearly. Instead, Adrian set the letter down slowly, his shoulders sagging almost imperceptibly, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried too long alone. "How did you know?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Elena stepped further into the room, some old familiar instinct in her softening despite everything. "The way you were holding it, and I noticed once before, when you signed a document during the council meeting. You traced the words with your finger before signing, the way someone does when they're not truly reading, just recognizing the shape of where to put your name." Adrian let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You're remarkably observant for a maid." "I try to be observant for a person," Elena said carefully, "not just a maid." He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her breath catch. Then he said, quietly, almost like a confession dragged out against his will, "My father believed reading was a weakness for a warrior king. Said words on a page were for scholars and diplomats, not alphas. He refused me tutors. By the time I took the throne, I was too proud and too afraid of exactly this kind of moment to ever let anyone teach me. I've spent years having documents read aloud to me, memorizing the shapes of my own signature, pretending. No one knows, not my advisors, not Captain Rowan, no one. Elena's heart ached for him in a way she hadn't expected. "I could teach you," she offered quietly. "If you wanted. No one would need to know." Adrian studied her for a long moment. The king who trusted almost no one, weighing whether to trust a servant girl with the single most closely guarded secret of his reign. Finally, he said, "Why would you do that for me?" Elena hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because I know what it feels like to carry something alone out of fear of what people would think of you if they knew." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Recognition, maybe, or the first small crack in 5 years of careful distance. "Tomorrow night," he said finally. "After the staff retires. Here, in this study. Tell no one." "I won't," Elena promised, and she meant it. Chapter 12. Their lessons began the following evening and continued 3, sometimes 4 nights a week for the following 2 months. At first, they were formal, careful, both of them keeping a respectful distance neither acknowledged out loud. Elena brought simple texts, children's primers at first, much to Adrian's visible embarrassment, though she reminded him gently that everyone starts somewhere, and that letters didn't care how old or powerful the person learning them was. Slowly, painstakingly, Adrian began to read. Elena discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that he wasn't slow because he lacked intelligence, quite the opposite. His mind was sharp, strategic, quick to grasp patterns once he understood them. He had simply never been given the chance, and had spent decades building elaborate systems to hide a gap that had nothing to do with his capability and everything to do with a father who'd failed him. Watching him sound out his first full sentence unaided, a passage from an old poetry book Elena had brought, about a ship finding its way home after a long storm, and seeing something like genuine wonder cross his face, undid something in Elena she'd thought long buried. She remembered, in fits and starts, why she had fallen for him in the first place, all those years ago. Not the king, not the alpha, just Adrian, the man underneath all of that armor, who it turned out had simply never learned how to let anyone close enough to see him without it. And Adrian, for his part, found himself looking forward to those evenings more than he cared to admit. Elena was patient in a way none of his advisors ever were. She never made him feel foolish, even when he stumbled over simple words. She laughed, really laughed, an unguarded sound he found himself chasing. When he insisted on reading an entire ridiculous poem about a fox stealing a farmer's boots, simply because he wanted to prove he could finish it without help. Somewhere in those 2 months, without either of them fully naming it, they started to fall for each other all over again. One evening, several weeks in, Adrian finished reading a short passage aloud, haltingly but without a single mistake, and looked up at Elena with something raw and unguarded in his expression. "I haven't felt this proud of anything in a long time," he admitted quietly. "You should be," Elena said softly. "You worked incredibly hard for this." Adrian was quiet for a moment, watching her in the firelight. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "When you first arrived, I thought—" He stopped himself. "What did you think?" Elena asked. "I thought I hated you," Adrian said plainly, and though the words should have hurt, there was no venom in them, only a kind of tired honesty. "For 5 years, I told myself I hated you. It was easier than admitting how much it hurt." Elena's throat tightened. "Adrian, I'm not finished," he said gently, and she fell silent. "I don't hate you anymore. I'm not entirely certain what I feel. But it isn't hatred. Not for a while now, if I'm honest with myself." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "That day, I know how it looked. I know what everyone believes happened. But I need you to know, whatever else is true, I never ran because I didn't care about you." Adrian's expression grew guarded again, old wounds rising close to the surface. "Then why did you run, Elena? I've spent 5 years trying to understand that. You wrote to me. constantly in the months before the wedding. And then, days before, you sent word through Marcus that... He stopped. Elena went very still. Marcus never gave you a letter. He said you asked him to deliver a message, that you couldn't bring yourself to say it to my face. I wrote you a letter, Elena said slowly, her heart beginning to pound. I gave it to Marcus to deliver directly into your hands 3 days before the wedding. I told him it was the most important thing I'd ever written. What message did he give you? Adrian's jaw tightened, old anger and confusion warring in his features. That you didn't love me, that you thought I was incapable of loving anyone, that you resented the marriage and only agreed to it out of duty, that you didn't want me to touch you or pretend at affection neither of us felt. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, horror washing over her as 5 years of misunderstanding began, finally, to crack open. Adrian, she said, her voice shaking, that is the exact opposite of everything I wrote. Chapter 13. What do you mean, the opposite? Adrian's voice had gone dangerously quiet, the voice of a king used to controlling every room he entered, now visibly struggling to control himself. Elena's mind raced back through 5 years to that letter, every desperate, hopeful word she remembered writing with trembling hands the night before she gave it to Marcus. I wrote that I was terrified you'd never love me, she said, tears now falling freely. I wrote that I understood you were raised to be strong, not soft, and that I didn't need grand gestures, I just needed something. One sign. One moment where you looked at me like I mattered to you beyond the treaty between our families. I begged you, Adrian. I told you I loved you, and that I was scared, and that if you felt anything for me at all, even a fraction of what I felt for you, I needed you to show me before the wedding, because I didn't think I had the strength to stand at that altar not knowing. Adrian had gone pale. That's not remotely what Marcus told me. Marcus never gave you the letter at all, Elena said, the pieces slotting into place with sickening clarity. He must have read it and then lied to you about what it said. Why would he? Adrian started, then stopped himself as understanding dawned, dark and furious. Because he wanted you for himself. Elena nodded slowly, the full scope of the betrayal washing over her in waves. He must have known that if you responded to that letter, if you'd shown me anything, any warmth at all, I never would have run. I only left because I believed with everything in me that you'd read what I wrote and simply didn't care enough to answer, that you looked at me the way you did at the altar because you'd read my heart laid bare and felt nothing back. I never saw that letter, Adrian said, his voice raw now, stripped of all its careful control. I stood at that altar believing you thought I was some emotionless brute you were being forced to marry. I told myself if that's genuinely how you felt, the kindest thing I could do was not pretend otherwise. I was cold that day because I thought that's what you wanted from me. Distance, not affection you didn't want. And I ran because I thought your coldness meant you'd read exactly how I felt and simply didn't feel it back, Elena whispered. They stood there, 5 years of pain, of separate suffering, of a marriage and a life together stolen by one man's lie, crashing down around them both at once. 5 years. Adrian said quietly, almost to himself. 5 years I told myself you never loved me. 5 years I let that belief turn me into... He gestured vaguely at himself, at the walls of the study, at the carefully guarded life he'd built. Into this. 5 years I believed the same about you, Elena said. I built a life on the belief that you never wanted me. That letter you thought I sent. I would never have written those words, Adrian. Never. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally looked back at Elena, his eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. Where is Marcus now? He asked, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He's dead, Elena said quietly. 5 months ago. Debts, and the men he owed them to. Something in Adrian's shoulders sagged. Not relief, exactly, but the deflation of a fury that had, for just a moment, had somewhere to go and now found nowhere to land. Then he escaped every reckoning he deserved. Adrian said bitterly. Maybe, Elena said softly. But Adrian, I need you to know, whatever happens now, whatever you decide, I am so sorry. Not for loving you, never for that, but for not trusting my own doubts enough to ask you directly instead of running. If I had just asked you face to face instead of hiding behind a letter and a friend I trusted too easily, and if I had simply come to you, Adrian interrupted quietly, instead of assuming the worst and hiding behind my pride, none of this would have happened either. We were both cowards, Elena. In our own ways. The admission hung between them, raw and honest, in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be in 5 long years. Chapter 14. Elena didn't know what to expect after that night. Would Adrian dismiss her from the palace, the truth too painful a reminder to keep close? Would he simply retreat back into the careful distance he'd perfected over 5 years, now that the anger had a name and a face, even one that could no longer answer for it? For a few days, he did pull back. Not cruelly, but with the careful, deliberate distance of a man processing something enormous. Elena continued her duties as though nothing had changed, though her heart ached with every polite, formal nod he gave her in passing. Then, 6 days later, she was summoned, not to the study for a reading lesson, but formally to the throne room in front of his full council. Elena's stomach dropped as she walked in, certain this was the moment her secret would be revealed publicly, certain whatever fragile trust they'd rebuilt was about to be dismantled in the most humiliating way possible. Instead, Adrian stood as she entered, and before the entire assembled council, he spoke. 5 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, this kingdom watched a wedding fall apart at the altar. Most of you believed, as I did, that the bride simply did not love her groom and fled rather than face a loveless marriage. He paused, his eyes finding Elena's across the room. I have recently learned that belief was based entirely on a lie, a deliberate deception by a man who is no longer living to answer for it, who intercepted a letter meant for me and replaced its truth with a cruelty designed to serve his own desires. Murmurs rippled through the council. The woman standing before you, Adrian continued, is not a servant girl named Ellie. She is Princess Elena, my betrothed of 5 years past, who returned to this kingdom not to reclaim a title but to save her dying brother's life, and who has worked in this palace for months without complaint to repay a debt she owed me nothing to acknowledge, having never wronged me in the way I believed. Elena's eyes filled with tears as the entire council turned to stare at her, shock and recognition rippling across every face. I am formally releasing Princess Elena from any remaining debt, Adrian continued, and restoring her to her rightful place and title within this court, effective immediately. He stepped down from the dais then, closing the distance between them in front of everyone, and took her hands in his, gently, deliberately, in a way he had never once allowed himself in public before. 5 years ago, I let pride and a lie cost me the woman I loved, he said quietly, though his voice carried through the silent hall. I am not interested in repeating that mistake. Chapter 15. He didn't propose that day, not formally, not with the kind of political ceremony their first arranged engagement had been built on. Instead, he asked for time. Time for them to know each other again, not as a princess and a political match, but as 2 people who had grown, changed, and suffered separately, now trying to find their way back to each other honestly. Elena welcomed that time gladly. There was healing to do, not just between the 2 of them, but within herself. 5 years of guilt, of grief over Marcus's slow unraveling and death, of raising Finn largely alone through hardship neither of them deserved. All of it needed space to breathe before she could step fully back into a role she'd once run from out of fear. Finn, for his part, adjusted to palace life with the easy resilience only children seem to possess, quickly becoming something of a favorite among the staff and, eventually, among Adrian himself, who found the boy's fearless curiosity and blunt honesty a welcome change from the careful diplomacy of court. "Are you going to marry my sister again?" Finn asked Adrian bluntly one afternoon, several weeks into Elena's reinstatement while the two of them sat in the palace gardens. Adrian, somewhat to his own surprise, had taken a genuine liking to spending time with the boy. "That depends entirely on your sister," Adrian answered honestly. "She still loves you," Finn said matter-of-factly in the way only children manage to be devastatingly direct. "She talks about you in her sleep sometimes, says your name." Adrian, king of Veyrith, feared by armies and respected by kings across 3 territories, found himself entirely undone by a 10-year-old boy's casual honesty. He proposed 3 weeks later, not in the throne room, not before a council, but in the palace gardens at sunset, the same gardens where Elena had once, years ago, first imagined what a life with him might look like. He didn't kneel with a rehearsed speech. He simply took her hands, the way he had that day in the council hall, and said, "I don't want a political marriage this time, Elena. I don't want duty or treaties or anything built to serve the kingdom before it serves us. I want you, only you, because I choose you, and because somewhere in the last several months I fell in love with you all over again. Not the princess I was promised, but the woman who scrubbed my floors and taught me to read, and never once let me feel small for needing to learn." Elena, crying freely now, didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Adrian, yes, 1,000 times yes." Chapter 16. Their second wedding, unlike their first, was smaller, quieter, held not in the grand chapel with its hundreds of witnesses and suffocating pearls, but in the palace gardens, under strings of soft lantern light, with only close staff, a handful of allied nobles, and Finn, insisting, with great seriousness, on the important job of carrying the rings, in attendance. Elena wore a far simpler gown this time, one she'd actually had a hand in choosing herself, light and unburdened compared to the ceremonial weight of the first. When she walked toward Adrian this time, there was no trembling uncertainty in her steps, no desperate searching of his eyes for a sign he might not give. Because this time, when she reached him, Adrian was already looking at her exactly the way she'd once prayed he would, like she was the only person in the entire garden, in the entire kingdom. "I love you," he said quietly, before the priest had even finished the opening words, unable to wait any longer to say it. "I should have said it 5 years ago. I'm saying it now, and I intend to keep saying it every day, for the rest of our lives." "I love you too," Elena whispered back, smiling through happy tears for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I never stopped. Not once. Not even when I thought you didn't want me to." This time, when they exchanged their vows, there was no letter needed to say what either of them felt. This time they said it themselves plainly, honestly, in front of everyone who mattered. Chapter 17. I'll leave you with this. A little over a year after their second wedding, the kingdom of Veyrith celebrated the birth of its first heir, a healthy baby boy, with his father's dark hair and, according to the palace nursemaids, his mother's exact same soft brown eyes. Adrian, the fearsome alpha king who had once ruled through cold distance and carefully guarded silence, was reportedly seen walking the length of the nursery at 2 a.m, gently reading aloud from a battered children's book, the very same primer Elena had first brought to their secret lessons years before, to a son who was, admittedly, far too young to understand a single word, but who fell asleep to the sound of his father's voice all the same. Finn, now a teenager, took to his role as uncle with predictable enthusiasm, teaching his baby nephew ridiculous nicknames the moment the boy was old enough to babble anything back. And Elena, Queen Elena, restored not by duty or treaty but by truth finally allowed to breathe, found at last the life she had once been too frightened to believe she deserved. A husband who looked at her, every single day, exactly the way she'd once prayed he would at their altar. A brother, healthy and thriving. A son who would never know a single day of the doubt and distance that had once cost his parents 5 years of their lives. Sometimes, late at night, Adrian would still ask her to read to him, even long after he no longer needed the help. Not out of necessity anymore, but because there was something between them in those quiet moments, something neither of them wanted to let go of. A closeness built not on titles or treaties or the desperate hope of a single unanswered letter, but on the simple, hard-won truth of finally, truly knowing each other. And that, in the end, was worth every single one of those 5 long, painful years apart. Outro. Read warmly, slightly slower. And that's the story of Elena and Adrian. A love almost lost forever to a single cruel lie, and the second chance neither of them ever thought they'd get. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. I love hearing which parts hit you hardest. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you want more stories like this one every week. And as always, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story. Endar.